The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the tranquil lake in soft golden hues. The water rippled gently, mirroring the clouds, drifting lazily across the sky. Jack Harmon, a middle-aged schoolteacher with salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet resilience, sat at the edge of the lake, his fishing line slack in the water. It was a scene of pure serenity, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. For Jack, this was his sanctuary, a place where the world's chaos seemed a distant echo. After losing his wife 3 years ago, the lake had become his refuge. He sought solace in its stillness, the mornings here a sacred routine to center his thoughts. But this morning felt different. Jack couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He scanned the shoreline, his gaze drifting to the far side of the lake, where the trees cast long shadows over the water. A strange noise punctured the calm, a frantic, high-pitched barking that set his nerves on edge. Jack squinted, focusing on the source of the sound. That's when he saw it. A dog, a medium-sized, scrappy-looking mutt, was thrashing in the water, its paws clawing desperately at the surface. The animal's panicked yelps echoed across the lake, tugging at Jack's heart. Without a second thought, he sprang to his feet, kicking off his boots as he ran. The distance to the dog seemed to stretch endlessly, the shore muddy beneath his bare feet. He didn't stop to think about the cold water or the possible danger. His only focus was reaching the struggling creature before it was too late. Jack plunged into the lake, the icy water shocking his system and stealing his breath. He swam hard, each stroke a battle against the numbing cold and his own panic. The dog's cries grew weaker as Jack closed the distance, his muscles burning with effort. Finally, he reached the animal. The dog's wide, frightened eyes locked onto Jack as if pleading for help. "I've got you, buddy," Jack muttered, wrapping an arm around the dog's trembling body. It didn't struggle against him, its energy nearly spent. Kicking hard, Jack propelled them both toward the shore. The water felt heavier with each stroke, but he gritted his teeth and pushed on. The moment his feet touched the muddy bottom, relief washed over him. He staggered onto dry land, collapsing onto the grass with the dog still cradled in his arms. Both man and animal lay there for a moment, gasping for air. The dog, a scruffy mix with matted fur, shivered uncontrollably, its thin frame betraying how long it had likely been wandering. Jack removed his jacket and draped it over the dog, murmuring soothing words as he gently stroked its head. "You're okay now," Jack whispered, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "You're safe." The dog, as if understanding his words, let out a soft whine and nestled closer to him. As Jack regained his strength, he noticed the dog's demeanor change. Its initial fear and exhaustion gave way to a restless energy. It stood on shaky legs, barked softly, and began pacing in front of him. Jack watched with curiosity as the dog sniffed the air, turned toward the forest beyond the lake and barked again, more urgently this time. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, sitting up. The dog stared at him, its tail wagging slightly before turning and taking a few steps toward the tree line. It paused, looking back at Jack expectantly. Jack hesitated. He had come here for peace, not adventure. But there was something in the dog's eyes, a mix of determination and desperation, that stirred his curiosity. Against his better judgment, he rose to his feet. "All right," he said, brushing the mud off his hands. "Lead the way." The dog barked once and darted toward the trees. Jack followed, his boots forgotten by the lakeshore as he stepped into the forest. The air grew cooler under the dense canopy of leaves, and the sunlight filtered through in fragmented patterns. Each step felt heavier, the dog's persistent barking the only guide through the unfamiliar terrain. Jack's mind raced as he followed the animal deeper into the woods. What could it possibly be leading him to? The dog's urgency suggested something significant, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was venturing into the unknown. With every step, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. Jack's breath quickened, his nerves fraying with each passing moment, but he kept moving, unable to ignore the pull of the dog's insistent call. Jack wasn't always this solitary. Just a few years ago, he had been part of a lively household, filled with laughter, plans, and dreams shared with his wife, Emma. She was the spark in his life, a woman who found beauty in the mundane and joy in the smallest things. But one stormy night, a car accident shattered that world, leaving Jack with nothing but memories and an aching void. After her passing, the lake became his haven, a place where he could sit with his thoughts, feel her presence in the wind, and pretend for a while that the world wasn't so empty. He often brought a photo of her tucked in his wallet, a quiet reminder of what he'd lost. That photo sat there today, forgotten in the rush to rescue the dog. Jack couldn't explain it, but something about this morning felt oddly familiar, as if life was stirring in a way it hadn't since Emma left. Saving the dog was instinctual, but as he caught his breath on the shore, he felt a strange spark of purpose, a fleeting sense that this moment wasn't random. As Jack sprinted toward the lake earlier, the dog's struggle became clearer. Its body bobbed in and out of the water, splashing violently as it fought against the unseen pull of the current. The lake, so calm a moment ago, now seemed alive, its gentle ripples replaced by frantic waves generated by the dog's thrashing. The animal's cries pierced the stillness, reverberating through the forest like a desperate plea for help. Jack could feel his pulse quicken as he pushed his legs harder, mud squelching beneath his feet. He knew the water would be frigid this time of year, but he didn't stop to consider it. All that mattered was reaching the dog in time. By the time he dove into the lake, his body was already moving on autopilot. The shock of the cold water hit him like a slap, but he ignored it. The weight of the water slowed him, every stroke a fight against resistance, but he could see the dog's panic and knew he had to act fast. As he grabbed the animal, its fur was sodden and cold to the touch, its weight far heavier than he'd anticipated. The lake and forest bore silent witness to the unfolding drama. The sky, painted in muted tones of pink and orange, seemed indifferent to the life or death struggle below. Birds paused mid-song, their heads cocked as if observing the unusual commotion. The rustling of the trees ceased momentarily, as though nature itself held its breath. The forest trail, where Jack had bolted from, lay empty now, his boots abandoned in the chaos. A squirrel peeked out from behind a tree trunk, its tiny eyes reflecting curiosity and caution. Even the wind, which usually whispered through the leaves, stilled momentarily, adding an eerie quietness to the scene. This contrast, the stillness of the surroundings and the frantic fight in the water, was stark. It highlighted the fragility of life, the way it could teeter on the edge of survival in a heartbeat. As Jack sat on the grass with the dog wrapped in his jacket, he noticed something peculiar. The animal, despite its exhaustion, seemed almost purposeful. Its eyes, large and expressive, locked onto his with an intensity that made him pause. It wasn't just relief or gratitude, it was as if the dog was trying to communicate something deeper. Jack couldn't explain the connection he felt. It reminded him of a time long ago when he and Emma had rescued a stray kitten. Emma had always believed animals had a way of sensing things humans couldn't. "They're more in tune with the world around us," she'd said once, smiling as the kitten purred in her lap. Jack hadn't thought much of it then, but now he wondered if there was some truth to her words. The dog barked softly, snapping Jack out of his thoughts. It stood up, shook off the last of the water, and began pacing. Jack frowned, watching it curiously. Was it agitated? Lost? Before he could dwell further, The dog turned sharply toward the forest and barked again, this time more insistently. The dog's persistence was impossible to ignore. Jack sighed, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He glanced back at the lake, its surface now calm again, the chaos of the rescue fading into memory. Everything in him wanted to stay, to wrap himself in the comfort of the familiar and let the day unfold as it always did. But the dog had other plans. It barked again, taking a few steps toward the forest before stopping to look back at him. Its tail wagged, but its posture was tense, as if urging him to hurry. Jack hesitated, his instincts battling his curiosity. "What is it, boy?" he muttered, standing and brushing the damp grass off his clothes. The dog barked once more, a sharp sound that echoed through the clearing. Jack sighed again, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said, his voice laced with reluctant amusement. "Let's see what this is about." With that, he stepped into the forest, following the dog into the unknown. Jack followed the dog deeper into the forest, the crisp morning air growing cooler with each step. The canopy above thickened, weaving an intricate web of branches that filtered the sunlight into fragmented beams. Shadows danced on the forest floor, creating an almost hypnotic effect. The dog trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure Jack was still following. The path was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and twisted roots that threatened to trip him. Jack's breath formed misty clouds in the chilly air, and he found himself shivering, not just from the cold, but from an inexplicable sense of unease. The silence of the forest was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of his boots and the occasional bark from the dog. After several minutes, Jack noticed signs that this trail wasn't entirely abandoned. A broken branch here, a footprint faintly etched into the dirt there. His mind raced with possibilities. Had someone else come this way recently? Was the dog leading him toward them? The questions gnawed at him, but he pressed on, his curiosity outweighing his apprehension. Suddenly, the dog stopped in its tracks. Its ears perked up, and it let out a low growl, staring intently at something ahead. Jack froze, his heart pounding. He followed the dog's gaze and saw what appeared to be a small, makeshift shrine nestled against the base of a tree. It was crude, a pile of stones arranged in a circle with what looked like an old, rusted lantern in the center. Jack approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any other signs of life. The shrine was weathered, its stones moss-covered and cracked. The lantern was empty, its glass broken and jagged. Jack knelt to examine it, feeling an inexplicable weight settle over him, as if the air itself had grown heavier. "What is this place?" he muttered, more to himself than the dog. The dog barked softly in response, its tail wagging as it nudged him forward. Jack took one last look at the shrine before standing and continuing down the path. The further Jack ventured, the more unsettling the forest became. The trees seemed older here, their gnarled trunks twisted into unnatural shapes. Faint carvings marked some of the bark, symbols that Jack couldn't recognize but felt oddly drawn to. He ran his fingers over one of the markings, the rough texture sending a chill down his spine. The dog, however, showed no signs of hesitation. It moved with purpose, its tail high and its ears swiveling, as if attuned to something Jack couldn't perceive. He envied its confidence. For every step he took, doubt crept deeper into his mind. Was he doing the right thing? By following this animal? What if it led him somewhere dangerous? As if to answer his thoughts, the dog suddenly stopped again, this time by a small clearing. In the center stood a worn wooden signpost, its lettering faded and barely legible. Jack squinted, trying to make out the words. The name Carter's Hollow was carved into the wood, along with an arrow pointing further into the forest. Jack's stomach tightened. He had heard of Carter's Hollow before, a place whispered about in local legends. According to the stories, it was the site of a tragic accident decades ago. A boating party had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their bodies never found. Some said the area was cursed, while others dismissed it as a tale meant to scare children. The dog barked sharply, pulling Jack from his thoughts. It stood near the signpost, tail wagging impatiently. Jack hesitated, glancing back the way he had come. The forest behind him was darker now, the path he had taken barely visible. Turning back didn't feel like an option anymore. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see where this leads." As they continued past the signpost, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig sent his heart racing. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but the forest remained empty. If there was someone or something else out here, it was keeping its distance. The dog led him to a narrow, winding trail that seemed to descend into a valley. The air grew colder still, and Jack could hear the faint sound of running water in the distance. He tried to focus on the dog, using its unwavering determination as a source of strength. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. He had come too far to turn back now. As Jack descended the narrow trail, the sound of running water grew louder, mingling with the rustling of leaves. The dog moved ahead with unyielding determination, its pace quickening as the valley came into view. Nestled at the heart of the clearing was a small cabin, its weathered exterior blending seamlessly with the surrounding wilderness. The structure leaned slightly, its wooden planks warped from years of exposure to the elements. Jack slowed his steps, a sense of foreboding settling over him. The cabin seemed abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless. Yet there was an undeniable energy about the place, as if it held secrets waiting to be uncovered. The dog barked sharply, breaking Jack's trance, and trotted up the rickety steps to the front door. It scratched at the wood, whimpering softly. Jack hesitated. Every rational part of him screamed to turn back, to leave whatever lay inside untouched. But his curiosity and the strange bond he felt with the dog pushed him forward. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the quiet valley. The interior of the cabin was dim, lit only by slivers of sunlight filtering through cracks in the walls. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by Jack's presence. The space was small, cluttered with old furniture and scattered belongings. A faded rug covered the wooden floor, and a bookshelf lined with ancient, moldy books leaned precariously against one wall. On a table in the center of the room lay an assortment of objects: a rusted lantern, a cracked porcelain doll, and a stack of yellowed papers. Jack's eyes were drawn to a photograph tucked beneath the lantern. He picked it up carefully, his breath catching as he recognized the dog sitting beside a young girl. The image was old, the colors faded, but the resemblance to the dog standing beside him was unmistakable. "What is this place?" Jack muttered under his breath. The dog barked in response, its tail wagging nervously. As Jack sifted through the stack of papers, he realized they were handwritten letters. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Each letter was addressed to someone named Emily. They spoke of love, regret, and guilt, a haunting narrative of a family torn apart by tragedy. One letter stood out. Its tone was frantic, the handwriting rushed and uneven. It described a boating accident that had claimed the lives of Emily's parents and siblings. The writer, presumably the father, blamed himself for the incident, detailing how he had taken the family on a trip to Carter's Hollow, despite warnings of dangerous waters. Jack's hands trembled as he read the final lines. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll understand. I built this cabin as a refuge for you, a place where their memories can live on. If you're reading this, Emily, know that I never stopped loving you." He set the letter down, his mind racing. Could this cabin have belonged to the family from the local legends? And if so, what role did the dog play in their story? The pieces didn't quite fit, but Jack felt he was inching closer to the truth. The dog barked again, snapping Jack out of his thoughts. It stood by a door at the back of the cabin, its tail wagging excitedly. Jack approached cautiously and opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air grew colder as Jack descended the creaking stairs, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. The dog followed closely, its nails clicking against the wooden steps. At the bottom, Jack found himself in a small cellar, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars of preserved food, tools, and other remnants of a life long forgotten. In the center of the room stood a large trunk, its metal edges rusted and its surface covered in dust. Jack hesitated before kneeling to inspect it. The lock was broken, allowing him to lift the lid with ease. Inside were more letters, along with personal belongings. A locket, a child's drawing, and a journal with Emily's name scrawled on the cover. Jack opened the journal, flipping through its pages. The entries painted a picture of a young girl grappling with loss and isolation. She described the dog as her only companion, referring to it as Buddy. Her words were filled with longing and sadness, but also a sense of resilience. One entry caught Jack's attention. Buddy keeps barking at the forest. I think he senses something out there. I'm scared, but he won't leave my side. I don't know what I'd do without him. Jack's chest tightened as he read. The journal ended abruptly, leaving many questions unanswered. Why had Emily stopped writing? And what had Buddy been sensing in the forest? As Jack closed the journal, a faint noise caught his attention. It was a low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from deeper within the cellar. He turned toward the source, his pulse quickening. The rhythmic thumping grew louder as Jack moved cautiously through the dimly lit cellar. The sound was unnatural, almost mechanical, and it sent a chill down his spine. The dog stayed close to him, its ears perked and its body tense, as if sensing his unease. "What is this, boy?" Jack whispered, though he didn't expect an answer. The dog let out a low whine, its tail wagging nervously. Jack hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Every rational thought screamed at him to leave, to walk back up those stairs, and to never look back. Yet something deeper, an unexplainable pull, urged him to stay. He thought of Emily, the young girl who had lived in this cabin, pouring her pain into the pages of her journal. He thought of Buddy, the loyal dog who had stayed by her side. Jack glanced at the dog beside him. Its unwavering presence gave him courage. He took a deep breath and followed the sound to a corner of the cellar. There he found a large wooden crate, partially covered by an old tarp. The noise seemed to be coming from inside. His hands trembled as he reached for the tarp. Pulling it back revealed a generator-like contraption, its gears clicking steadily. It looked far too advanced for the cabin's rustic setting, its metal surface gleaming as if it had been recently cleaned. Jack leaned closer, examining its intricate design. Strange symbols were etched into the machine's casing, symbols that matched the carvings he'd seen on the trees earlier. "What the hell is this?" Jack muttered, his voice barely audible. The dog barked sharply, startling him. It pawed at the ground near the crate, as if trying to draw his attention to something else. Jack knelt and noticed a small, locked compartment built into the base of the machine. He needed answers, but every step deeper into this mystery only raised more questions. Jack sat back on his heels, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The symbols, the machine, the journal, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle, but the image they formed remained maddeningly unclear. His thoughts drifted to Emma, his late wife. She had always been the one to solve riddles, the one to make sense of the world when it seemed too chaotic. Emma would have loved this, he thought bitterly. She would have dove headfirst into the mystery, her curiosity and determination driving her forward without hesitation. Jack, on the other hand, had always been the cautious one, the skeptic. But now, in this strange and silent cellar, he felt an odd sense of purpose, as if solving this puzzle would somehow honor her memory. The dog nudged his hand, pulling him from his thoughts. Jack looked down at the animal and saw something in its eyes. a quiet determination, almost human in its intensity. It reminded him of the bond he and Emma had shared with their own pets, the unspoken understanding that transcended words. With a renewed sense of resolve, Jack stood and examined the compartment again. He ran his fingers over the lock, its surface cool and smooth. It was old but sturdy, and he'd need tools to open it. As he searched the room for something useful, the dog let out a low growl, its body stiffening. Jack turned sharply, his pulse quickening. The faint sound of movement echoed from the staircase, the creak of a floorboard above. He wasn't alone. Jack froze, his heart pounding as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Each creak of the floorboards above sent a jolt of fear through his body. The dog, standing rigid by his side, growled softly, its ears pinned back and its gaze locked on the staircase. He glanced around the dimly lit cellar, searching for something, anything that could serve as a weapon. His eyes landed on an old iron rod leaning against the wall. Quietly, he grabbed it, the cool metal reassuring in his hand. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the air, heavy and suffocating. Jack's grip on the rod tightened as he listened intently, his breath shallow. Suddenly, the stairs creaked, and a shadow appeared at the top. "Who's there?" Jack called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. For a moment, there was no response. Then, a low voice echoed down the staircase, calm but laced with menace. "I could ask you the same thing." The figure descended slowly, and as it stepped into the faint light of the cellar, Jack saw an older man with a wiry frame. His face was weathered, his eyes cold and calculating. He carried a hunting knife, the blade catching the dim light. "This is private property," the man said, his tone sharp. "What are you doing here?" Jack raised the rod defensively. "I could ask you the same question. I followed the dog here. It led me to this place." The man's eyes flicked to the dog, his expression briefly softening before hardening again. "That dog... I should have known," he muttered, more to himself than to Jack. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." The tension in the room was palpable as Jack stared down the intruder. The dog stood between them, its tail low and its body tense, as though ready to spring into action. The man gestured toward the machine with his knife. "You see that thing?" he said, his voice bitter. "It's not just some relic. It's a mistake, one that should have been buried along with its creator." Jack frowned, glancing back at the machine. "What are you talking about? What is this thing?" The man let out a bitter laugh. "That's a question for Emily's father. He built it, said it would change everything, fix the tragedy he caused. But all it brought was more pain." Jack's mind raced. The letters, the journal, the symbols, they were all connected to this machine. Emily's father. He built this after the accident, didn't he? The man nodded. He couldn't live with what he'd done, so he tried to build something to make it right. But it didn't work the way he hoped. Instead, it turned this place into a magnet for things that don't belong in this world. Jack's stomach churned. "What kind of things?" The man's eyes darkened. "You don't want to know." Before Jack could respond, the dog barked sharply, drawing their attention to the far corner of the room. The rhythmic thumping sound had returned, louder this time, and accompanied by a faint, eerie glow emanating from the machine. The man's face twisted with fear. "It's too late," he muttered. "We've woken it up." "What do you mean?" Jack demanded, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he backed toward the stairs, his knife raised defensively. "You should leave," he said. "Now." But Jack didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the glowing machine, his mind racing with questions. The dog barked again, its urgency pulling him from his thoughts. Whatever was happening, Jack knew he couldn't walk away. Not yet. The thumping grew louder, echoing through the cellar like a heartbeat. The faint glow emanating from the machine intensified, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jack's pulse raced as he stepped closer, unable to tear his eyes away from the contraption. The dog growled softly, its body rigid with tension. The man on the stairs cursed under his breath. "You don't know what you're doing," he shouted, his voice trembling. "That machine wasn't meant to be turned on. It was a prototype, a failure." Jack turned to him, his grip tightening on the iron rod. "Then help me understand. What is this thing? What does it do?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Jack and the machine. "It's a bridge," he said finally, his voice low. "A bridge between our world and whatever lies beyond." Jack's blood ran cold. The symbols on the machine, the carvings on the trees, the strange energy that seemed to permeate the air, it all pointed to something far more sinister than he had imagined. "You're saying this thing opens a portal?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded grimly. "Emily's father thought he could use it to bring his family back. He believed their souls were trapped on the other side. But he didn't know what he was dealing with. The machine opened the portal, all right, but what came through wasn't his family." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at the dog, its gaze locked on the machine. "And the dog?" he asked. "How does it fit into all this?" The man's expression softened. "Buddy was Emily's protector. Even after she was gone, he stayed by her side. When the machine activated the first time, Buddy stopped. Whatever came through, he's been guarding this place ever since." The machine's glow pulsed brighter, its thumping now a deafening roar. Jack took a step back, his mind racing. "If it's a portal, can't we shut it down?" The man shook his head. "We can try, but it won't be easy. That thing doesn't just close, it fights back." Before Jack could respond, the machine let out a low, guttural hum that resonated through the cellar. A crackling energy filled the air, making the hairs on Jack's arms stand on end. The glow from the machine coalesced into a swirling vortex, its edges flickering like flames. Jack shielded his eyes from the intense light. "What's happening?" he shouted over the roar. "It's opening!" the man yelled back, gripping his knife tightly. "Something's coming through!" The vortex expanded, and a shadowy figure began to take shape within its depths. It was amorphous at first, a shifting mass of darkness, but as it stepped closer, it solidified into a humanoid form. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its presence exuded a palpable sense of dread. The dog barked furiously, positioning itself between Jack and the entity. Jack could feel the creature's gaze pierce through him, its presence overwhelming. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The man's face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped his knife. "It's one of them," he said. "They don't belong here." The entity stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It reached a hand toward the machine, as if drawn to its energy. The air grew heavier, and Jack struggled to breathe. "We have to stop it!" Jack shouted, adrenaline surging through him. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on the machine's control panel. Symbols glowed faintly on its surface, their patterns shifting and pulsing in time with the vortex. The man nodded. "If we can shut it down, we might be able to send it back." Jack hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. The symbols on the panel were unfamiliar, their meanings a mystery. "Do you know how to work this thing?" he asked. The man shook his head. "I've never dared touch it." "But you don't have a choice. Figure it out." The entity let out a guttural roar, its voice reverberating through the room. The dog lunged at it, barking and snapping at its heels. The creature swiped at the dog, but Buddy darted out of reach, his movements quick and precise. Jack's hands shook as he approached the control panel. He traced his fingers over the symbols, his mind racing. Somehow, he felt as if he understood them, not in a logical way, but on a deeper, instinctual level. Taking a deep breath, he pressed one of the glowing symbols. The machine let out a high-pitched whine, and the vortex flickered. The entity froze, its glowing eyes narrowing as it turned toward Jack. "You've angered it," the man shouted. "Hurry up!" Jack pressed another symbol, then another, his movements frantic. The vortex began to shrink, its edges curling inward. The entity let out a howl of rage, lunging toward Jack. Buddy intercepted it, barking ferociously as he bit into the creature's arm. The entity recoiled, swiping at the dog with its clawed hand. Buddy yelped but didn't back down, his determination unwavering. Jack pressed the final symbol, and the machine emitted a blinding light. The vortex collapsed in on itself, pulling the entity with it. The creature let out one last ear-piercing scream before it disappeared into the void. As the light faded, silence enveloped the cellar. The machine powered down, its glow extinguished. Jack collapsed to the floor, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The man sat on the stairs, his knife resting limply in his hand. Buddy limped over to Jack, his fur singed but his eyes bright. Jack reached out and stroked the dog's head, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You saved us, boy," he whispered. The man let out a shaky laugh. "That dog's been saving people for years," he said. "Guess he's not done yet." Jack looked around the cellar, his mind racing with questions. What had he just witnessed? And what did it mean for the future of this place? The man stood, his expression somber. "You should leave," he said. "This place isn't safe. It never has been." Jack nodded, his body aching as he rose to his feet. He looked down at Buddy, who wagged his tail weakly. "Come on, boy," Jack said. "Let's go home." As they climbed the stairs and stepped out into the sunlight, Jack felt a strange sense of closure. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. The bond between him and Buddy was unbreakable. The morning sun had risen higher, its warm rays breaking through the dense canopy as Jack emerged from the forest. Buddy trotted beside him, his movements slower but determined. Jack's clothes were damp and muddied, his body aching from the ordeal, but his mind was sharper than ever. As they approached the lakeside, Jack paused, turning to look back at the forest. The cabin, the machine, the entity, all of it felt like a distant dream. Yet the tension in his chest reminded him it was very real. He wondered how many others had ventured into those woods, unaware of the secrets buried within. Buddy barked softly, pulling Jack from his thoughts. He knelt and ran his fingers through the dog's fur, his touch gentle and grateful. "You're a brave one," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The dog wagged his tail, leaning into Jack's touch, as if to say, "We did it together." The two of them continued along the trail back to Jack's car. The silence between them was comfortable, a stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind. Jack knew that life would never feel entirely normal again, but somehow he didn't mind. He felt lighter, as though some unseen weight had been lifted. Back home, Jack opened the door to his small, cluttered house. It wasn't much, but it was comfortable, filled with the little reminders of the life he'd once shared with Emma. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at the photo of her on the mantel. Her smile seemed to welcome him, as if she approved of the new companion by his side. "Come on in, boy," Jack said, stepping aside to let Buddy enter. The dog hesitated at first, sniffing the air cautiously before padding inside. He explored the house with curiosity, his nose leading him from room to room. Jack chuckled softly, watching Buddy's tail wag as he discovered his new surroundings. "Looks like you're settling in," he said. "Guess this is your home now." He filled a bowl with water and set it on the floor. Buddy drank eagerly, his exhaustion evident in the way he slumped to the floor afterward. Jack sat beside him, his hand resting on the dog's back. The bond between them felt unshakable, forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. Jack found himself smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that he hadn't worn in years. For the first time since Emma's passing, he felt a spark of hope for the future. That night, as Jack lay in bed, his mind wandered back to the cabin. The symbols on the machine, the letters from Emily's father, the entity, they all swirled in his thoughts, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. He retrieved the journal he'd taken from the cabin, flipping through its pages under the soft glow of his bedside lamp. Emily's words were haunting, filled with both despair and resilience. She'd written about feeling watched, about hearing whispers in the woods at night. Her descriptions of Buddy painted the dog as a guardian, a steadfast protector against the unseen forces that lurked in the forest. Jack closed the journal, his fingers tracing the worn cover. He felt an inexplicable urge to return to the cabin, to uncover the truth about what had happened there. But a part of him knew it was better to leave the past buried. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Buddy, lying on a dog bed Jack had hastily assembled from old blankets, lifted his head and looked at him. Jack smiled. "I guess you'd know better than anyone, huh?" he said softly. The dog wagged his tail once before resting his head on his paws. In the days that followed, Jack found himself adapting to life with Buddy. The dog's presence brought a sense of companionship that Jack hadn't realized he was missing. Their routines became intertwined, morning walks along the lake, afternoons spent in the yard, and evenings by the fire. The ordeal in the forest had changed Jack. He no longer felt like a man going through the motions. Instead, he felt alive, his days filled with purpose. He began volunteering at a local animal shelter, inspired by the bond he'd formed with Buddy. Helping other animals find homes brought him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as Jack sorted supplies at the shelter, he overheard a couple talking about strange occurrences near Carter's Hollow. They described seeing lights in the forest and hearing unexplainable sounds. Jack's stomach tightened, but he kept his thoughts to himself. He returned home that evening, his mind racing. The forest still held its secrets, and the idea of others stumbling upon them filled him with unease. But as he looked at Buddy, peacefully napping by the fire, Jack knew he couldn't let fear consume him. He'd faced the darkness once, and he was ready to do it again if necessary. For now, though, he chose to focus on the present. The future could wait. 1 month later, Jack found himself back at Lake Laurel. The water glimmered in the early morning light, its surface undisturbed save for the gentle ripples of the breeze. Buddy sat beside him, his tail wagging lazily as they both stared out at the horizon. Jack closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the lake wash over him. The events of the forest lingered in his memory, but they no longer felt as heavy. He had come to accept that some questions would remain unanswered, and that was okay. Life wasn't about having every piece of the puzzle. It was about finding peace with the pieces you had. "Funny how things work out, isn't it?" he said aloud, scratching behind Buddy's ears. The dog let out a contented sigh, leaning into his touch. Jack thought back to Emma, to the long walks they used to take by this very lake. He wondered what she would think of all that had happened. Would she have been proud of him? Would she have laughed at the absurdity of it all? The thought brought a small, bittersweet smile to his face. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. The sun had climbed higher, its rays warming his skin. The lake stretched out before him, unchanged and eternal, a reminder that life went on. Later that day, Jack sat down at his desk, the journal from the cabin open in front of him. He flipped to a blank page and began to write. His words weren't for anyone in particular. They were simply a way to capture his thoughts, to make sense of the journey he'd been on. He wrote about the importance of courage, of facing the unknown even when it seemed insurmountable. He wrote about resilience, about finding strength in the darkest moments, and he wrote about connection, the bond between humans and animals, the way a loyal companion could pull you through when all else felt lost. Buddy lay at his feet, snoring softly. Jack glanced down at him and smiled. "You're quite the storyteller, you know that?" he said. As the sun set, Jack's pen slowed. He leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the fading light. He didn't know if anyone would ever read what he'd written, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had found his voice again. In the weeks that followed, Jack decided to share his story. He spoke at community events, sharing his experiences with Carter's Hollow and the lessons he'd learned. He encouraged others to adopt animals, to find companionship and joy in the bond between humans and pets. He also urged caution to those who ventured into the forest. While he avoided delving into the supernatural details, he emphasized the importance of respecting nature and being mindful of its mysteries. "There's a lot we don't understand," he said at one gathering, "but that doesn't mean we have to be afraid. We just have to be prepared and respectful." Jack's words resonated with many. People began to approach him with their own stories, tales of rescues, of animals that had changed their lives, of encounters that defied explanation. Jack listened, offering advice and encouragement, his own journey serving as a reminder that even the most ordinary lives could hold extraordinary moments. As Jack looked out at the audience, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just telling a story, he was helping others see the world and themselves in a new light.